a gold-plated restaurant in the heart of New York, radiant as if every candle, every crystal glass was eager to boast of its opulence. But within that glittering brilliance, an unexpected stillness emerged, a crack in the painting that had seemed flawless. The shrill laughter of Madame Liang Zhou ripped through the air. In my country, black women are fit only to scrub toilets. Strange that in America, they're allowed to wear a waiter's uniform. The words fell like a knife, cutting through every whisper, through the gentle music of the piano in the corner. Heads turned. A few forks froze mid-air. At the very center of that silence, Naomi Carter, clad in a red blouse and white apron, stood motionless. In her hand, a bottle of fine French wine quivered, the dark red liquid shimmering as if about to spill. At the following table, a couple stiffened. The man frowned, about to rise, but his wife pressed her hand on his, whispering, "Don't, she's a billionaire. We shouldn't interfere." At another table, a girl of about 10 looked up in bewilderment and asked her mother, "Mum, why did that lady say that? What did she do wrong?" The mother bit her lip, tightened her grip on her child's hand, and dared not answer. Naomi remained silent. Her eyes were lowered, as though focused on pouring wine, yet the bridge of her nose trembled faintly. In the magnificent room, she suddenly became a shadow that could so easily be erased by power and contempt. Madame Zhou sipped her wine, her cold laughter continuing to echo. The American business people seated at her table did not understand Chinese, but they exchanged uneasy glances. The forced smiles on their faces could not conceal their discomfort. Naomi drew in a long breath but gave no reply. Her silence, quiet, restrained yet never submissive, tightened the atmosphere like an invisible cord around the room. The entire hall fell still, and in that silence a hidden flame was lit. Naomi Carter set the bottle of wine on the table, as gently as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. No one noticed that her hand had trembled for just a second before steadying again like the surface of still water. To the restaurant's patrons, she was nothing more than a server, an invisible figure existing only when needed to pour more wine or clear a dirty plate. But Naomi had not always been this. Once, she had stood at the lectern at Harvard, her voice steady and confident. She had written a thesis on Chinese diplomatic culture, a work many professors praised as a bridge between two worlds. At the age of 25, Naomi could fluently interpret US-China negotiations, respected by diplomatic delegations who called her the woman with ears that understood two civilizations. And then, in a single day, everything collapsed. A false accusation that she had leaked classified documents to a Chinese journalist flooded the press. Though the FBI later officially declared her innocent, the stain of suspicion never left her name. Every career door slammed shut, every job application ignored. At 28, Naomi, who had once stood in international halls of power, now stood in the kitchen of a restaurant, forced to wear a red uniform and a white apron. "Stay silent, Naomi. The more you speak, the less they believe you." Her mother's warning still echoed. Naomi's mother, a retired nurse, knew too well what it meant to be shut out because of color and gender. Sometimes you must learn to keep your dignity in silence. One day, truth will speak for you. Naomi believed in that. But each time she passed a mirror, seeing herself in the waitress uniform, she felt as if she herself had vanished. Tonight, as Madame Zhou's venomous words were unleashed, all of Naomi's past came flooding back. She remembered the press conference a year earlier when a white reporter had pointed directly at her and asked, "How do you respond to being called China's pawn?" She had stayed silent, not because she lacked words, but because in that room where the outcome was predetermined, any words would have been meaningless. Now inside La Vigne Royale, the eyes of the surrounding diners mirrored those of the press that day, mingling pity, discomfort, and cold indifference. At a nearby table, a middle-aged man shook his head and whispered to his companion, "I feel sorry for her, but stepping in would only bring trouble." His friend nodded slightly, then continued cutting his steak as if nothing had happened. Naomi heard it all. With ears trained to capture every nuance in a diplomatic negotiation, no whisper escaped her, yet she did not react. She stood tall, her eyes lowered, but inside, every insult etched itself into her like a scar. Naomi's silence was not weakness. It was the fragile shield she had to survive. Yet within that silence ran an undercurrent, a quiet strength waiting to be released. In the corner, an entertainment journalist, there only to capture a few images of the elite, quietly switched on his recorder. He did not understand Chinese, but the imbalance in the air, the pain in Naomi's eyes, and the mocking laughter of Madame Zhou were enough to tell him there was a story here that needed to be said. Naomi stepped back, holding the tray against her chest, her legs firmer than before. She knew well, if she allowed herself to break tonight, then everything her mother had sacrificed, everything she had studied, everything she had fought for, would dissolve. She chose silence. But silence did not mean acceptance. In Naomi's calm eyes, a flame was being guarded, a flame no one in that gold-plated room could see. The sound of her high heels rang sharply against the marble floor, each arrogant step of Madame Liang Zhou slicing through the space of the restaurant. The powerful woman was draped in an emerald silk gown, a great pearl necklace at her throat so large it caught the crystal light and scattered it into blinding rays. She needed no introduction, for the name Zhou alone stirred murmurs at the surrounding tables. That's Madame Zhou, the Chinese tech billionaire. She controls tens of billions. A few whispered, their voices tinged with both awe and caution. Zhou approached the grand table where 5 American businessmen were already seated, among them Robert Hayes, a magnate in electronic component imports, his eyes alight with hope. To him and to the others, Zhou was the key to unlocking billion-dollar contracts. The moment Naomi came to pour the wine, Zhou's glance skimmed over her as though she were a worthless ornament. Then, in clear, deliberate Mandarin, loud enough for the entire table to hear, yet confident no one else would understand, she said, "Black women, the lowest of all. In America, they are allowed to stand near the rich. How absurd." Naomi heard every word. For a fleeting second, her nose tightened, but her hand held the bottle steady, not a drop spilled. One of the American business people furrowed his brow, glancing at Zhou. "Madame Zhou, what's so funny?" Switching to English, she slowed her speech deliberately, as though speaking to children. "I was only saying that in my country, people like her," she jerked her chin towards Naomi, "would only be allowed to scrub floors. Strange that here they're given clean uniforms." The table fell into silence. One man swallowed hard, his eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi, before quickly turning away. No one objected. No one spoke. In the following table, a young couple exchanged glances. The woman whispered, "I can't bear this. How can they let her say that?" Her husband squeezed her hand. "Shh, don't make trouble. That's a billionaire's table." Naomi dipped her head slightly, pulling the bottle back, her lips pressed tight. She uttered not a single word. Madame Zhou let out a contemptuous laugh, sharp as shattering glass. "You know, in China, everyone knows their natural place. Women serve men, and black people, they serve everyone." The words fell heavier than the crystal chandelier above. A nearby waiter frowned, about to step forward, but the restaurant manager seized his arm and whispered, "Don't interfere, that's an important guest." Naomi heard, saw, and felt it all. Everything remained silent. And that silence was more painful than the insults themselves. The splendid room seemed to shrink, leaving only a naked truth. A black woman turned into entertainment before all, and not one dared to speak. The sound in the restaurant seemed strangled. The clinking of spoons against plates, the slicing of knives through meat, usually a steady rhythm, fell silent, leaving behind an emptiness that felt terrifying. The lavish space of La Vigne Royale, where everything was arranged to showcase refinement and power, suddenly became the stage for a public humiliation. Naomi Carter stood there, both hands holding the wine tray like the only shield between her and the storm. Light reflected off her red uniform and white apron, making her stand out amidst the sea of black suits and glittering gowns. To everyone's eyes, she should have been nothing more than a faint backdrop to the scene. But now every gaze turned toward her, not with respect, but with curiosity mixed with unease. Madame Liangzhou leaned back in her chair, lips curling into a sinister smile. She took a sip of wine, swirling the glass in her hand as though weighing a cheap trinket before deciding to discard it. Then, in English laced with deliberate emphasis, she spoke loudly enough not only for her table, but for several surrounding tables to hear. "Isn't it funny? In America, it is called equality. But look, black women are still standing here, holding a tray of wine. You call that progress? What a joke." Her words cut through the air like a blade, slicing into Naomi's flesh and into the heavy silence of the room. A man at a nearby table gave a slight snort, then bent his head to eat as though he had heard nothing. A young woman winced, placing her hand on her boyfriend's shoulder, about to speak, but then stopping. That indifference to Naomi weighed even heavier than the mockery itself. Zhou placed her glass down, tapping the table lightly as though issuing a command like a queen to her subjects. "You there, waitresses, come closer." Naomi stepped forward. Her legs remained steady, but each step felt like walking across sharp stones. Zhou looked Naomi up and down slowly, with disdain. Then, leaning toward the American business people, she lowered her voice, but still clearly enough for Naomi to hear every word. "Do you see, they never dare lift their heads. Black women are born to bow." An American businessman swallowed hard, his eyes briefly meeting Naomi's before darting away. He knew it was wrong, but the billions on the table had locked his throat shut. Naomi stayed silent. Her face revealed no change. Her eyes looked straight ahead, but never directly. She knew one wrong glance could cost her the job instantly, and she could not let that happen. Madame Zhou chuckled coldly, then switched to Mandarin, her voice lilting like a cruel tune, stretching each word. "Black women are like shadows. No one really sees them until they make a mistake, and then everyone remembers their color." Naomi understood every syllable. Pain gripped her chest, yet her face remained composed. In the following table, a girl of about 10 asked her mother again, her voice innocent. "Why is that lady saying mean things about her, Mum? She didn't do anything wrong." The mother bowed her head, whispering, "Hush, don't ask. Rich people think they have the right to do whatever they want." That answer was not intended to explain the situation to the child, but rather a quiet confession of helplessness. Naomi heard it, and her heart tightened. She remembered herself at 10 years old when her mother had taken her to the supermarket. A security guard had followed them down the aisles simply because they were black and dressed in plain clothes. Little Naomi had asked, "Mum, why are they staring at us like that?" And her mother had forced a smile. "Because they don't believe we can afford to buy anything here." That shame, thought buried by time, now surfaced again, vivid, alive, inside this gilded room. But Madame Zhou had not finished. She dabbed her lips with a napkin, then turned to Naomi. "Tell me, do you even know how to use chopsticks, or only how to hold a mop? A black woman learning Chinese culture. What a ridiculous sight." Laughter rose from her table, not loud, but sharp and cutting. Some guests at other tables, not understanding Mandarin, saw only the scene of a powerful woman ridiculing a black server, and they chose silence. Naomi set the tray down, bent in a polite bow, then quietly stepped back. Every movement was neat, composed, but inside her heart was being crushed. A senior waiter by the bar shook his head, whispering to a colleague, "I can't believe this. Just because she's a black woman, they think they can say anything." His colleague replied timidly, "If we interfere, we'll lose our jobs." That truth was as harsh as an unspoken sentence. In this world, silence was often bought by fear. Naomi glanced around the room. The crystal glasses still gleamed, the candles still burned, the piano still played its refined melody. But all of it felt like a curtain concealing a truth. Black women like her had never been seen as fully human. Madame Jo rested her chin in her hand, raising her voice deliberately so that everyone in the hall could hear. In China, we know how to keep order. Men come first, women stand behind, and blacks, she jerked her chin toward Naomi. Blacks should serve everyone. That is their natural place. The room burst into uneasy murmurs. A few diners, unable to contain themselves, slammed their cutlery onto their plates. A man muttered to his wife, "I can't believe this is the 21st century." Naomi stood motionless, her hands clasped behind her back. Her face was calm, but in her eyes glimmered something else, a deep light, not resignation, but waiting. That night, in the gold-plated room, arrogance and prejudice draped themselves in emerald silk, laughing among crystal glasses. And amid it all, there was only one young black woman, in a red uniform and white apron, silently holding her ground, a silence that made the air even heavier. No one knew that this silence was the beginning of a storm. The air inside La Vigne Royale seemed to grow thick. The crystal chandeliers still blazed, the candles still flickered, the piano still played. But instead of evoking luxury, they transformed the room into a vast stage, where every gaze was fixed on Naomi, the black woman in a red uniform and white apron. Madame Liangzhou leaned back in her chair, her diamond-ringed hand swirling her wineglass with ease. Her face glowed with delight, as if she were savoring a private play of her own direction. She lifted her chin, this time deliberately speaking in English. Loud, clear, each word cutting. "In America, you call this progress. A black woman serving your wine, and you dare call it equality. What a joke." The entire room froze. The nervous laughter that had rippled earlier was gone. The American business people at her table flushed with embarrassment. A few glanced at Naomi, then quickly dropped their eyes to their plates, pretending to be busy with knives and steak. Naomi heard every syllable. These words were no longer hidden behind Mandarin. Now they were laid bare, open, undisguised, unavoidable, like a public sentence pronounced against her dignity before dozens of witnesses. At a nearby table, a middle-aged woman turned away, tears gathering in her eyes. She clutched her young daughter's hand. "Never believe this is normal. This is wrong, very wrong." The child stared wide-eyed. "But why doesn't anyone say anything, Mum?" The mother fell silent. What could she answer? That in this room, money had bound every tongue. Naomi still stood there, silent as a statue. She poured the remaining wine, her movements so calm they might fool one into thinking she hadn't heard a thing. But in her dark eyes, the words carved themselves like knives into stone. Madame Jo's lips curled into a smirk. This time she switched back to Mandarin, her voice cold and sharp. "Black people in America think that having jobs means success, but they are still enslaved. Only now they wear cleaner uniforms. The West is a joke." Naomi understood every word. Her hands tightened faintly behind her back, yet her face remained composed. A few American businessmen could not follow the Mandarin, but they sensed the atmosphere of contempt weighing down the room. Robert Hayes, who had signed many contracts with Jo before, leaned forward, trying to change the subject. "Perhaps we should return to discussing the contract terms." But Jo waved him off, her shrill laughter echoing through the hall. "No, Mr. Hayes, tonight this is the lesson. Look closely at her." She jabbed her finger toward Naomi. "This is what happens when you believe in equality. You end up with people like her pretending they are more than they are. A few diners shuddered. A young man slammed his glass on the table, muttering, "This is too much." But when Joe's eyes swept toward him, he fell instantly silent. Naomi bit down on her lip. Memories surged, memories of the investigation days when the press had branded her a traitor. Although she had been exonerated, her friends had turned away, and colleagues had shunned her. The contempt she felt now was no different from then. Only this time she wore a white apron, standing before someone who openly treated her as an object. Madame Zhou continued, now as if lecturing the entire restaurant on social order. In China, we know the natural order. Men lead, women follow, and black people serve everyone else. That is civilization. From farther tables, a few outraged gasps broke out. One guest stood up, storming out, shaking his head furiously. But most remained in place, restrained, because no one dared to confront a billionaire like Joe. Naomi drew a long breath. Her mother had once told her, "Sometimes you must learn to remain silent, because the world will not always hear the truth." But silence does not mean you are invisible. Silence is waiting for the right moment to speak. She repeated those words to herself. Zhou stared at Naomi with disdain. "Tell me, girl, do you even know where China is? Or have you never left Harlem in your life?" The room held its breath. The American business people flushed red, staring at their plates. A few diners turned away, unable to watch. Naomi remained silent. She did not answer, nor did she flinch, her hands clasped behind her back. Zhou burst into loud laughter, her voice echoing across the hall. "See, that's the proof. They don't even dare to speak. That is their nature." That laughter twisted into Naomi's chest like a blade. But deep inside, she knew her silence now was not cowardice. Her silence was waiting. A few diners quietly reached for their phones, secretly recording the scene. An elderly waiter wiped tears from behind the bar, whispering, "No one deserves to be treated like this. No one." In this gold-plated hall, where power and money were revered as supreme, a young black woman was being humiliated in public. No one protected her. No one spoke. That silence resounded louder than Joe's cruel laughter. And within that silence, a flame began to rise, a flame not yet seen by anyone. In the luxurious space of La Vigne Royale, the crystal chandelier hanging above still blazed with brilliance, but its light was no longer warm. It was cold, casting harsh clarity on every downcast eye, every flushed face of shame, and the sneering smile of Madame Liang Zhou, the Chinese tech billionaire who had turned the dinner into a racist tirade. Naomi Carter stood by the table, her back straight, both hands clenched together behind her white apron. The sting of those public insults still echoed in her mind. They said silence was golden, but tonight silence seemed only to make her a target, a stone wall for others to hurl their contempt against. Robert Hayes, the American businessman at the head of the table, wiped sweat from his brow and forced himself to speak. "Madame Zhou, perhaps we should focus on the contract." He spoke with such caution, as though every word might cost billions of dollars. Zhou tilted her head slightly, her crimson lips curling into a mocking smile. She tapped her glass against the table, the sound sharp and piercing, before replying, Mr. Hayes, contracts. Don't be so hasty. This is the lesson. You Americans are so naive. Do you think giving a black woman a job pouring wine counts as progress? It's truly pathetic." Her English was fluent, yet she deliberately twisted her accent, mimicking ignorance. The entire room shuddered. Another businessman coughed lightly, trying to break the tension. "Madame Zhou, we are here to discuss a strategic partnership. It would be better if—" Zhou cut him off, this time switching back to Mandarin, her voice cold and biting. "In China, we understand what power is. Men lead, women follow, and black people serve everyone. That is the natural order. You call it equality. That is why America is weak. Naomi caught every word, her chest tightened, yet her face remained calm, her eyes fixed on nothing. Whispers rippled from nearby tables. A middle-aged man, unable to contain himself, slammed his cutlery down. My God, what century does she think this is? His wife tugged at his arm. Be quiet, don't interfere, this isn't our business. The man bit his lip, his eyes filled with helplessness. In the corner, an entertainment journalist, who had only planned to snap a few photos of the wealthy, quietly began recording video. His lens focused on Naomi, capturing every moment of her silent endurance, every venomous word spilling from Joe's mouth. Naomi remembered the days spent inside the State Department conference rooms when she was a young interpreter. She had once translated weighty phrases of mutual respect and equal cooperation. Yet now in New York, in her own country, the humiliation of a black woman was treated as sport. Joe's voice rose again, not just to her table, but as if lecturing the entire room. You Americans are weak. You think giving rights to women and black people is progress. But what do you get? A servant standing here, too afraid to look me in the eyes. A few diners shook their heads, muttering, "Shameful, outrageous." But then they too fell silent. The truth was, no one wanted to stand against a Chinese billionaire who controlled tens of billions of dollars in contracts. Naomi heard everything and committed every word to memory. Yet she still chose silence. Her silence was no more extended submission. It was the endurance of someone waiting for the right moment. A waiter by the bar muttered under his breath, "No one deserves to be treated like this, no one." He moved to step forward, but the manager seized him, whispering, "Don't be stupid. She's the most powerful guest tonight. Interfere and you'll lose your job." Those words landed like a cold verdict. Money mattered more than dignity. In Naomi's mind, her mother's voice echoed, "Silence is not cowardice. Silence is waiting for the right moment to show the world the truth." Naomi drew a long breath, stepped back, holding her tray close, her eyes lowered. To many in the room, she looked utterly resigned. But none of them knew that in that moment, every insult Joe hurled was being stored in Naomi's mind, each piece of evidence building toward a coming storm. Madame Joe took another sip of wine, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness, yet each word was poison in the air. "And you know what the problem with America is? You give too much freedom to people who should only serve. That is why you will always lose." Robert Hayes turned pale. He knew that if these words were recorded and leaked, the damage would be far greater than a lost deal. It could spiral into a diplomatic scandal. Yet he still did not dare intervene. The room was dead silent. Only Joe's voice lingered, along with the heavy breathing of those who witnessed it all. Naomi still stood there, a solitary figure amid the glittering lights, between power and the cowardly silence of all. Deep inside, she felt every rope of humiliation tightening around her. But instead of breaking her, they stretched her heart taut, ready for the moment it would snap free, unleashed. That night in New York, amidst golden tables and billion-dollar contracts, people witnessed a painful truth. Political interest had been placed above human dignity. But that same night, a seed of defiance was planted in the calm, unwavering eyes of a black woman. The atmosphere in Vigne Royale tightened like a violin string about to snap. Madame Liang Zhou's venomous words had turned the opulent dining hall into an arena where human dignity was trampled, and Naomi Carter, in her red uniform and white apron, became the focal point of humiliation. Naomi stood still, hands gripping the empty tray. Inside her, a storm churned, but outwardly she remained composed. From the beginning of dinner, she had been turned into a living example for a cruel philosophy of racism. But Madame Joe was not finished. The billionaire leaned forward, her eyes gleaming like a predator who had found a new sport. Her voice rang out, not only directed at Naomi, but deliberately pitched to the entire hall. "Look at her. This is the so-called modern America. A black woman in uniform, head down, silent. Tell me, is this equality? Or is this proof that no matter what you give them, they will always stay below us? The words fell heavy, like a hammer blow. At a nearby table, a young woman shook her head, whispering to her husband, "This is horrible. Why isn't anyone doing something?" Her husband frowned, then lowered his gaze into his wine glass, muttering, "You don't understand. This is politics. To interfere is to invite ruin." Naomi remained silent, but her eyes lifted slightly, and for a brief moment, the crystal light reflected into a steady flame of resolve. Madame Jo had not noticed. She continued, now as if entertaining her table. "Hey girl, come here." Jo beckoned, her tone like someone calling a pet dog. Naomi stepped forward. "Do you know how to dance, like a monkey?" Jo squinted, her lips twisting into a cruel smile. "Show us. Give us a funny show." The entire room fell into stunned silence. A spoon clattered to the floor. Several guests gasped, their mouths agape, unable to believe what they had just heard. An older gentleman exclaimed, "This has gone too far." But he fell quiet at once when Jo's eyes darted toward him. Naomi clutched the tray tighter, her hands trembling. Inside her chest, her heart pounded as though it might burst through years of restraint. She remembered being a child, mocked by neighborhood kids who called her monkey because of her curly hair and dark skin. Then her mother had held her close and said, "Don't let them decide who you are. Let your dignity answer for you." And tonight, in the middle of New York, those words returned. Not from thoughtless children, but from one of the most powerful women in Asia. Jo laughed loudly, turning to the American business people. "See, she doesn't move. She doesn't protest. That is their nature. They obey. They know their place." Robert Hayes sat frozen. He knew if anyone recorded this and it spread, their careers, their billion-dollar deals, everything would vanish. But he also knew speaking up here, before Jo, meant killing the contract immediately, and so he chose silence. In the corner, the entertainment journalist gripped his phone, his hands trembling. The lens captured everything, every insult, every indifferent glance, every silent tear of an elderly waiter standing by the bar. The restaurant no longer radiated luxury. It had become a grey portrait of collective cowardice, where money bent heads down, leaving only one black woman driven to the edge of humiliation. Naomi drew in a deep breath. Her shoulders trembled briefly, then straightened. Her eyes gleamed with a determined light. She was no longer silent merely to protect her job. She was quiet to wait for the right moment, the moment her silence would thunder like a storm. Madame Jo raised her glass triumphantly. "This is the real America, my friends. A circus where black women pretend to be equal but end up serving at the table. And you call this democracy?" A few guests could no longer contain themselves and rose to their feet to leave. But most remained seated, chained by wealth and power. Naomi stared straight at Jo, and in her gaze lay a silent promise. The storm was coming. Madame Liangzhou's laughter still rang out, shrill like a blade scraping glass, spreading through the grand hall. Her insults lingered in the air, making every breath heavy. Everyone in Vigne Royale felt as though they were witnessing a cruel farce that none dared to stop. Naomi Carter stood motionless, her hands gripping the wine tray so tightly, her knuckles turned white. In her heart, old scars bled anew. The suspicious eyes of the press, the whispers of traitor, the cold handshakes from former colleagues, all of it pressing down on her chest like a suffocating weight. Jo tilted her chin, her red lips curling into a sneer. "Well, are you going to dance for us, little monkey?" The question was the final drop that overflowed the glass. Naomi slowly set the tray down on the table. The faint sound of metal touching wood rang out softly, yet in the silence it echoed like a warning bell, signaling that something was about to change. She drew a deep breath and lifted her head. The dark eyes that had remained quiet all evening now blazed like two blades. The hall froze, for everyone felt something rising within them. And then, in precise, resonant Mandarin, Naomi spoke. "Madame Zhou, perhaps you have mistaken this place for a circus. Here, human beings are not pets for your amusement." The restaurant exploded into stunned silence. A few diners were so astonished they dropped their cutlery. A young woman gaped, whispering to her husband, She speaks Chinese." Robert Hayes leapt to his feet, nearly spilling his wine. "Impossible." Madame Zhou was struck dumb, her face shifting from arrogance to shock, then draining pale. The glass in her hand slipped to the floor, shattering, red wine spreading like blood. "What? What did you just say?" she stammered, her voice trembling for the first time that night. Naomi did not switch to English. She kept to Mandarin, her voice steady and commanding, each word like a hammer breaking the walls of prejudice. And it is amusing when someone confuses money with education, status with dignity, and power with the worth of a human being. But this language, this culture, it is not a weapon for you to humiliate others. The hall fell silent, broken only by a rising murmur of whispers. "Who is she?" "waitress, speaking Mandarin like a scholar." Zhou stammered, struggling to recover. You can't. You are just a waitress." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes blazing. "Yes, I am a waitress tonight, but I am also Naomi Carter, Harvard graduate, former interpreter for US-China negotiations, a woman who lived in Beijing for 5 years, and I understood every single word you have spoken in the last 90 minutes. A wave of gasps swept the room. Many guests hurriedly pulled out their phones to take a photo. An elderly waiter nodded slowly, his eyes brimming with tears, as though he were finally witnessing justice prevail. Naomi continued, her voice unwavering, growing stronger with each word. "You believed a black woman could not understand your culture. You believed silence meant submission. However, the truth is that silence is strength. And tonight I am silent no longer." Zhou trembled, retreating into her chair, desperately trying to recover her arrogance. You dare humiliate me in front of everyone?" Naomi answered calmly, still in Mandarin, her voice slow and deliberate. "No, Madame Zhou, I am not humiliating you. I am simply returning to you what you have sown. You turned this room into a courtroom, and now everyone here is a witness." The atmosphere cracked open. A few guests leapt to their feet in applause. A middle-aged woman hugged her daughter, eyes shining with tears, whispering, "Do you see, my child? Sometimes silence knows when to wait to speak." Robert Hayes rose, his voice shaking. "My God, she's been listening the whole time." Zhou gasped for breath, her face ghostly pale. Power, money, status, all suddenly meaningless. She sat clutching her chair, while Naomi stood tall, composed, shining like a candle that could not be extinguished. And everyone in the hall knew. In that moment, a black woman, once treated as invisible, had overturned the game before their very eyes. The final echo of Naomi's words still lingered in the air as La Vigne Royale sank into a suffocating silence. But this silence was different from the earlier fear and indifference. It was charged, ready to erupt. Every gaze turned to Naomi, not as if looking at an invisible server anymore, but as though witnessing someone rising in the storm. Madame Liang Zhou sat frozen in her chair, her face drained of all color. For the first time that evening, her sneer had vanished, replaced by panic she could no longer conceal. Naomi quietly drew a phone from the pocket of her apron. She lifted the glowing screen, her voice calm yet resounding. "I didn't just listen, I recorded everything. Every word you said in Mandarin, every insult you hurled in English. Everyone here is a witness. And now—" She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "There's nowhere left for you to hide." A ripple of commotion swept the hall. Diners whispered, phones were lifted, and cameras rolled. At the bar, an elderly waiter, eyes brimming with tears, whispered, "At last, someone dares to speak for us." Robert Hayes, the American businessman who had sat silent with bowed head, now sprang to his feet, his voice trembling. Naomi Carter, I know that name. You were a Harvard scholar. You once worked as a translator for the U.S. Department of State. My God! And we allowed you to be humiliated like this? Naomi nodded slightly without triumph. Her voice was steady, resolute. Yes, I was a scholar. I once stood in international chambers. But tonight I am just a waitress. And no matter the role, I am still a human being. And human beings do not deserve humiliation for the color of their skin or their gender. Jo stammered, her hand trembling as she set down her glass. You wouldn't dare to release that recording. Naomi gave a faint smile, her eyes cold but her tone even. Madame Jo, you recorded yourself when you turned me into your spectacle. I merely recorded the truth. And truth doesn't need permission to exist. The hall erupted in exclamations. Some guests applauded. A middle-aged woman held her daughter close and whispered, "Now do you see, child? That is true power. Not money, not influence, but truth." Jo tapped her hand on the table, desperate to reclaim control. This is outrageous. You don't understand the consequences. Billions of dollars, contracts, diplomacy. Naomi cut her off, her voice strong, resounding through the hall. No, Madame Jo. It is you who doesn't understand. Dignity is not a commodity to be weighed against contracts. Respect is not a gift to be bought with money. And black women are not tools for you to lecture about power. A burst of applause rose from the back of the hall, then another table, and another. Soon the entire restaurant thundered with clapping. The sound drowned out the screams inside Jo's mind. Zhu sat pale, collapsing back into her chair, her lips trembling. You can't destroy me like this." Naomi took a step forward, her eyes blazing under the crystal lights. "I am not destroying you, Madame Jo. You did that yourself. I am only shining a light on the truth." Robert Hayes turned to the other American businessman, his voice firm, for the first time speaking openly. "We cannot sign a contract with someone like this. Not after what was said here in front of us all." Another businessman, his face flushed red, nodded. "Yes, our honor is worth more than billions." Applause erupted again, louder this time. Some diners recorded the event, while others live-streamed it on social media. News began to spread beyond the gilded walls. Naomi gazed at the hall. In her eyes was a strange serenity. All the resentment, humiliation, all the silence carried through the years, finally released. She spoke her last words, not for Jo, but for everyone. Silence can last an hour, a day, or many years. But when it finally speaks, it is louder than any shout. Tonight, I have been silent long enough. Jo bowed her head, trembling, no longer the formidable billionaire. Around her, people rose to their feet, clapping thunderously. Naomi stood tall, her back glowing under the crystal light, an image none in that room would ever forget. In that moment, power had shifted entirely. 3 days after that evening at Vigne Royale, New York City seemed transformed, as if it had shed its old skin. In the press, on television, and across social media, not a single line mentioned Waitress's new technology, nor its billion-dollar contracts. Everything revolved around one image. A black woman in a red blouse and white apron, standing tall in the storm of humiliation, her gaze calm yet blazing. Naomi Carter. That name now appeared everywhere, not as a story of pity, but as a symbol of dignity. Across the Pacific, in Shanghai, the morning broadcasts ran the same headline. Billionaire Liang Zhou loses 80% of US contracts after racist scandal. The video from Vigne Royale had been shared over 60 million times in a single week. The moment Zhou smugly called Naomi a little monkey and then froze in shock when Naomi responded in flawless Mandarin became a clip that shook the world. In a closed-door meeting, the Zhou family announced her suspension from all positions. A cold voice from an uncle said on a video call, "You didn't just lose contracts, You disgrace the nation. You will step down indefinitely." From a haughty billionaire, Joe was now a pariah, cast out by the very elite society that once celebrated her. At the same time in New York, Naomi sat silently before her computer screen. Emails poured in, invitations to lecture at universities, interview requests from CNN, BBC, the New York Times. One invitation reduced her to tears. Harvard Kennedy School wanted her to return as a visiting lecturer in international relations. That evening, she returned to her small Harlem apartment where her elderly mother was waiting for her. The same mother who had once taken her hand and said, "Silence is to wait for the day you will speak." She held Naomi tightly, her voice trembling. "You did it. You made the whole world listen." On Monday morning, a special meeting was held at Whitmore Capital headquarters. More than 1,000 employees, from New York to Singapore, tuned in via live stream. In the Great Hall, Naomi stepped up to the podium, no longer in a waitress's uniform. She wore a simple navy suit, her hair neatly tied back, her face radiant but never arrogant. When she spoke, the hall fell silent. "I am not standing here to recount my humiliation. I am standing here to remind us all. Our silence in the face of injustice is complicity. If no one had recorded that night, if I had not lifted my head, then the story would have ended as just another humiliation. But it did not end that way, because truth always finds a way to speak." Thunderous applause erupted. Some in the audience wept. Across America, restaurants and corporations announced new zero-tolerance policies, no leniency for racism or sexism. People called it the Naomi Protocol. On social media, the hashtag #StandWithNaomi gained worldwide attention. The image of her standing tall with the wine tray became a symbol of black women's courage, women who had been demeaned for far too long, far too many times. One evening, after all the uproar, Naomi returned to Vigne Royale. The restaurant was now packed, many coming simply to sit in the very room where the story had unfolded. The manager came out, bowing deeply. "Ms. Carter, from today, these doors are always open to you, not as an employee, but as an honored guest." Naomi only smiled. She didn't need recognition. What she wanted was to keep for herself a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, an ordinary woman can change the world. When Naomi left the restaurant that night, New York still glittered with lights. But within her heart shone another kind of light, one not born of crystal or gold, but of human dignity. And the story closed, though its echoes endured. Dignity is not given by money or power. It is revealed the moment silence finally dares to speak.